Ruth chapter 1, verse 22 is where we're going to be starting out this evening. And while you're turning there to Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, again, I want to remind you what the book of Ruth is about. It's not about, it's primarily not about this woman named Ruth, although there's a lot about this woman named Ruth. In fact, when you think about, we get to really know Ruth, we really don't know much about her. All we know is she was a Moabite, and that's it. It's the only family history we know. In fact, I just assumed when I was a kid, I don't know how many of you assumed this too, I assumed Ruth and Orpah were sisters. Anybody else ever think about that? Am I the only one? Okay, maybe so. Mr. Lambach, you and I are somewhat on the same page with that stuff. No? All right. I always just assumed Ruth and Orpah were sisters, but the Bible doesn't say that. It's just all we know about Ruth is, again, she's a lady from Moab. She pops on the scene, and it's amazing how God uses her. What we know about Naomi is she was married to Elimelech, came in Moab, is going to go back to Israel. We don't know much, again, a lot about their background. What we do know is that God is going to use them. God is going to redeem them. Ruth is a story of redemption. Remember, redemption really involves two main things. It involves a pit and a price. Someone doesn't have to be spiritually. Even when it came to redemption, Old Testament law, someone would get in a bind. They'd sell themselves or their land for just to get themselves out of a debt. And then once they, again, want to redeem themselves out, then someone has to purchase them out of that mortgage or out of them selling themselves, buy them back again. So someone would, again, be in a bind, someone would be in a pit, and then a price would have to be paid to get them out of that. Naomi, pit that she was in, was three different things. Emotionally, she was grieving pretty hard. She had a lot of affliction. She had lost her, physically speaking at least, she had lost her husband and her two sons. Circumstantially, she was in a bind. Without a husband, without two sons to provide for her in that day and age, it is not like modern-day America. You're in a real bind. In fact, it's some deathly circumstances that you're looking for not only poverty, but you're looking for possibly dying of starvation in those circumstances. She also was in a hard place, spiritually speaking. I'm not saying that I would do any better in Naomi's situation. I'd like to think I would. But quite honestly, I haven't been through what she's been through. And because of hard circumstances, it influenced her, didn't force her, but it influenced her to be bitter against God. So in three different ways, emotionally, circumstantially, and spiritually speaking, she's really in a deep place, a place that she cannot get herself out of. She's going to have to respond to God's grace, but it's going to take a work of God's grace to get her out of that. Then we have a lady by the name of Ruth, who, interestingly enough, came to know God because of a sin of somebody else. Because Elimelech chose to do what was wrong and lead his family into Moab, for whatever reason, because there was a famine and he decided he could get better provision there, he went outside of God's will and went to Moab. Because of that, a lady by the name of Ruth, who grew up an unbeliever, as Ruth was an unbeliever. Am I on there? Let me see. Hold on for a second. Yes, I'm on. Because Ruth was an unbeliever, she didn't know anything about the God of Israel. What she did know is that she knew of this lady named Naomi, and she started learning more about not only Naomi, but about her God. Because Elimelech made a bad decision and went to Moab, she married this man by the name of, it's either Mahlon or Chilion, forget which one now. But the bottom line is she married Naomi's son and got to know Naomi and got to know Naomi's God. So we're looking at not only Ruth's redemption, we're looking at, first of all, Naomi's redemption, who's in a pit emotionally, circumstantially, and spiritually. We're also looking at Ruth, who she starts off really spiritually destitute, like we all start out, by the way. She was not just a Moabite by birth, but also by practice. So how do I know that? Because without knowing the God of Israel, she's going to be starting in idolatry. Whatever idol it was, Moloch or whatever, didn't make any difference, or Chemosh, that's not the issue. The issue was she didn't know God personally. Then she gets to know Naomi and gets to know her God, and we first of all see Ruth's redemption starting. We saw that start in Ruth chapter 1 when she told Naomi, your God will be my God. And so God started redeeming her spiritually. She became a follower of God, and now we're going to see that redemption work out in her life. God is going to also provide for her physically, for her circumstances, and for future generations. Redemption, though, is going to involve work because of trusting in God's provision. I feel this sermon is a little bit weird after what I preached this morning, as we talked about how Paul, it was about self, not about Christ. That's true. But Paul wasn't focused on his works. He was focused on the work of Christ. This evening, we're going to talk about God's grace, but how God's grace worked through Ruth's work. It's not the fact that it's Ruth and God. It's just that by Ruth trusting in God, she followed God's plan of provision by working out in the fields. I actually believe the book of James touches on this a little bit when it doesn't talk about work in as opposed to faith, but the work of faith. We're going to look at Ruth's work of faith, a work that came out of her faith in God. So follow along. I'm going to read Ruth chapter 1, verse 22 through chapter 2, verse 7. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn, after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap, in other words, she happened to come. She happened to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto his servants that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued, even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. This evening, we're going to look more at Ruth, more of her character. I'm going to skip some certain parts about Boaz because my plan, Lord willing, would be next Sunday evening to go more into Boaz. So we got the different characters in this story here. There's not a lot said about Elimelech other than the bad decision he made to go to Moab and his 2 children to marry Moabites. Orpah, we don't know much about other than the fact that she married one of the children and then stayed in Moab. But the people we do get to know is Naomi and Ruth and now Boaz. Really, that's the 3 main characters in this story that the book of Ruth focuses upon. We start out here learning more about Ruth in chapter 2. We get to know more about her, not really so much her personality. I have no idea what she liked, what her preferences were. I don't know if she was colorblind. I don't know if she liked meatloaf. I don't know any of those things. What I do know is we have part of her character mentioned here. That really, I say character, let me say this, her trust in God was mentioned. She's not a perfect person. She's a sinner saved by grace. In my opinion, at this time, that at the beginning of Ruth chapter 2, I don't believe Ruth is a mature person. I don't think there's anything wrong with her. I just think that she's just starting out in the Christian faith. I wouldn't expect her to be mature, but she's going forward. And honestly, as I look at Ruth, I, in a heartbeat, I like getting around those that are hungry for God, as opposed to those maybe that know a lot about God and have done some things in the past, but their hunger for God has dwindled. I enjoy people like Ruth that, again, it doesn't matter whether they are 20 or 90, they have a hunger for God. I love that about Ruth. And by the way, I want you to know Naomi, she's going to later on, God's going to do work in her life. She's going to respond to that, and she's going to go forward in her believer's life also. First thing we mentioned here in verse 22 is that they came back in the beginning of barley harvest. Anybody ever watch, okay, I'm not the only one. You all have watched Little House on the Prairie, right? Remember Little House on the Prairie? There's this one scene, and I don't know what episode it was, but my mouth starts to water as soon as I think about it. And I'm forgetting who's the father in Little House on the Prairie? What's his name? What is it? Charles. Charles what? Not Lambach. Okay, Ingalls. Okay. Charles Ingalls is that I remember when Mr. Ingalls, he gets home from whatever journey or from the hard working, and Mrs. Ingalls, right at that point, you've got those ovens. She's taking this, it's this round loaf of bread. It looked like barley bread to me because, again, it wasn't in the knife loaf you have, it just this round loaf coming out. And she takes it, and it's nice and hot, and I see him, he breaks off a piece of that. Well, let me get you some butter. She says, no, you don't need it with this nice hot bread. I'm just getting hungry just thinking about that right now. And I think about the bread that they would have had of that barley loaf. Barley loaf was it would be something that was, it had nutrition to it, and it was something that people survived on and lived on. But for the most part, barley was given to the animals, and barley was given to the poor people. It wasn't as high in the totem pole as wheat. Ruth and Naomi are going to start with the barley harvest they're getting back on. Later on, the wheat harvest is coming. But I just want to say this, is that Ruth is, first of all, going to take advantage of something that is, as nice as it looked on a TV show, this nice hot bread coming out, it was not that way back then of the barley. It's something that took a lot of work to mill. It's something that would, again, it wasn't as, at least it wasn't as high in the totem pole as wheat. But she's going to take advantage of that barley harvest. Her and Naomi they're going to take of that barley. They're going to have to, I can't even imagine this. I personally, the only bread I have personally made has been in a pre-measured thing in a bread maker. I can't imagine, in fact, a lot of you all, I think when you make bread, you start with the flour. Back then, they didn't have flour to start with. They would take the grains, they'd crush it down as much as they could, and usually that didn't even happen until the end of harvest. But for people that were poor, I mean, this would be on a daily basis. They'd get back, they'd sell the grain, they'd have to crush this grain to get it into small enough to get it into flour. Then they'd take that flour and however they would prepare the dough and then get it ready to make barley bread or barley cakes. In fact, sometimes they wouldn't have the yeast or it wouldn't be available. They wouldn't have enough time to let the thing rise, so it would just be maybe flat barley cakes that they'd be eating. Ruth, when she got back, and Naomi, they came in the beginning of barley harvest, not as good as wheat harvest, but it's something that God is going to use to provide for them. Look, if you would, at chapter 2, verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Just want to mention one thing. There's a reason for God mentioning every person he does in Scripture. I do not understand a lot of the different names in Scripture, what's important about this name or that name, but it's important to God. And if God is mentioning Boaz, there's going to be a specific part Boaz is going to play in God's plan. No one is by accident. In fact, a lot of times in our life, even the people that we think we'd rather not be around, God does not place those people in our lives by accident. It doesn't mean they're meant to be our best friend. But it does mean that nothing happens by accident, and God is going to use Boaz. Verse 2, And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field, and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. You know, that last part, I like the fact that she said that, Go, my daughter. I just think there must have been something about that hard trip that they took all the way that is really just, it mentions that they went from Moab to Bethlehem, just one verse, but it was a long trip. They had to travel a long way. Wilmington says it was about a 100-mile journey from the place around about the area they'd be in Moab all the way to Bethlehem. They would probably, as they go on their journey to there, they'd probably huddle together for warmth. They'd probably watch out for each other to try to protect each other from wild animals on this journey. And they probably grew a bond by working together, battling the hardships of the elements, coming together. And yes, Ruth was technically her daughter. They would refer to daughter-in-laws that way. But I think she's realizing that, at least just the glimmer, the start of the fact that she's realizing, you know what? I cannot bring my sons back. I cannot bring my husband back. I can't change my circumstances. But she's starting to get thankful for Ruth. Not just go, Ruth, but go, my daughter. I just see something God working in Naomi's life. The reason that Naomi and Ruth went back to Bethlehem is because they heard there was food there. They heard there was bread. So that's why they went back, and now they've got the problem of where are they going to get the food? They're coming, and I don't know how much savings they had left from being in Moab, probably not much. But as they get back here, just assuming they have nothing, Naomi, by the way, would have a piece of land that would belong to her husband. Because everybody, when they inherited land, it would stay in that family. But likely, when they went to Moab, it's likely Elimelech would have mortgaged that land. They couldn't sell it outright. Because at the end of, in the year of Jubilee, in that 50th year, all the land would go back to the people that they mortgaged it to. So really, in Israel, if you're going to sell some of your land, that land would eventually come back to you again. So the best you could do is lease it or mortgage it. There were certain exceptions when you're selling things to priests and things like that, but the bottom line is, regardless of what happened to their land, whether it was mortgaged or they had someone else taking care of it, even if that land was immediately available to them, likely wouldn't have been any use. I know a number of you have grown up on a farm. You know that if land just stays there for year after year, 10 years they've been in Moab, they're not just coming back to that land, putting a seed in, the next day that's coming up in barley harvest. Nothing's going to happen then. They're going to that land would have to be, even if they could get a hold of that land, which likely they couldn't, it was likely mortgaged and not available to them. Even if they could, it would take time to cultivate and farm that land. So they're coming into Israel with no food, no really place to harvest from and get and earn a living. Maybe they could make clothes or whatever they could do, but the bottom line is they need food to survive. So God had actually put a system in there. It was called gleaning. And the way that process worked is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 9, here's what God says. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. And thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So what they would do is back then, they would have, and this would really test out how much people wanted to follow God's law. I always assume, you look at the fields today, that it seemed like we have these tractors, and they are basically in these rectangle or square portions. Well, back then, if you had a square field, what they would actually do is they'd have the oxen or whatever was up, and they'd maybe go in a circle around that field, cultivating the grain in that field. And once you're getting to the edges there, you would leave that. You leave the four corners undone, so that it wouldn't be plowed, it wouldn't be harvested. It would be the word, wouldn't be reaped. Back then in Israel, you also not only had that you leave the corners for the stranger and the poor, which would both really, Ruth and Naomi would fall under that category. Ruth would be the stranger and poor. Naomi would certainly be poor. But they also had something where if you're gleaning your field and this is why you probably wouldn't want, you, you probably would really teach your junior high boys if you're teaching how to glean your field, because once you're harvesting that field and you drop something on the ground, the rule was you had to leave it on the ground. And you know how little kids are. It's almost like when they carry something, they're dropping half of it. So I can just imagine that the parents teaching their kids, when you're doing that field, and don't, make sure you hold it tight and you put it in the sheaf there and bind it when you're doing it. And what they would normally do is they'd reap some of it, they'd bind it there, they'd bind it, and then they would keep it in the field to the end of the day, then they would take it out. But something that they'd accidentally leave it out in the field, maybe that the end of the day they'd leave something out in the field, it was to stay. The poor were allowed to take that. This was not God's welfare program, it was God's cultivation program. It wouldn't be just giving out free money and crippling people, which would be like a modern welfare system like we have. This would be something to enable people to, even if they're poor, to be able to harvest and take some of this for themselves. Now, we're going to look at Ruth in just a moment, but I'm going to mention Boaz just really quickly because God is going to work in both Boaz's and Ruth's life because of their obedience to God. It's going to be God's grace, but their obedience. Ruth, the Bible says, happened to come in part of the field, go in part of the country there, where that belonged to Boaz. Now, I don't know that she'd know it. I don't know that every part of that field had something called Boaz, and even if it was signs up there, she wouldn't even know who Boaz was at that point. But all she knows is she's looking for part of a field to be able to reap from. And so she goes out there in barley harvest. She sees maybe a part of, okay, this is something where I can glean. I can take some dropped grain, or I can take some from some of the corners of the field there. And so what she would do is, we find out later on in this chapter that she had gone up to the head of this field, to the person who was over the reapers there, and said, would you let me glean in this field? Now, technically, she may or may not have had the right because she's not an Israelite, but at least she was going to be courteous anyway and ask. So she did that. And so what she does is she goes in this field because there's certainly going to be grain to reap. Now, if you were a fleshly person, and if I'm just thinking, if I'm out for myself, and I did not believe God's law, and I was not a generous person, I can tell you exactly what I would do. First of all, if I'm going, I would make my field almost as oval as possible. I'd go as close to the edges of that field that I possibly could so that I can gain as much harvest as I could, basically leaving so little for the poor that it's ridiculous. Then also, something I would do is if you're not going to be able to reap the edges of your field, then what that means is, what's the point of actually plowing that ground and making sure it's seeded? You wouldn't really want to take care of the edges of your field unless you're somebody that was generous, that was following not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit of God's law. And so the reason I'm bringing that out is because Boaz had a field that was still harvested. Even the best I can tell is that during the time of famine, Boaz hadn't left, the best I can tell. He had still plowed and he had still cultivated his field, and there was places where the poor could still reap in that field. And there's always going to be people in this world that will complain. This is you and I too. We'll complain about our circumstances, but we're not taking advantage of what God has given us. We're not following God's law, and we're reaping what we had sown. By the way, the reason that Boaz and Ruth are even meeting whatsoever is, yes, it's God's grace. There's no question about that. But also, Boaz actually had a field that had been worked. There's places for the poor to be able to glean. He had followed, to some degree at least, God's law. And God is going to use a sinner called Boaz, who's following God. God is going to use a sinner known as Ruth, who's following God, and work his wonderful plan out in their life. By trusting God and being obedient to God, they're going to yield the blessing of God. I want us to look if you would, at verse 2 again. It says, And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. This is a reminder to you that in the King James Bible, the word corn is just referring to grain in particular. You say, well, corn is not the same thing as barley. Well, this is old British English, not even American English. Corn is just referring to grain. So that can refer to wheat. That can refer to barley. Any type of grain that they would harvest there would be considered a type of corn. So anyway, she's going to go out into the field and reap this corn. And the reason that she's doing this all goes back to a decision. The reason that all this is going to work out in the end of Book of Ruth, it goes back to a decision that she made in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, where she trusted God with her life no matter what, no strings attached. And because of that, she left Moab to go to Israel. Because she's in Israel, she's now going to reap. She's got to take care of herself and her mother-in-law. She's going to go into this field, and field just happens to be Boaz's field. Things are going to work out. God's going to work out his plan in a wonderful way. But Ruth is going to, it starts out by trusting God, no strings attached, and then using the means that God had provided. It's for poor people. It's a humble means. It's a means that if I was in Ruth's position, I would feel pretty embarrassed by doing that. I'd feel pretty embarrassed going out I'd first of all feel embarrassed going up to the head man over the reapers there and say, hey, would you mind if I reaped in your field, if I gleaned? And maybe he'd say something like, well, what's wrong? Don't you have a harvest? That is, what happened to your field and your harvest? Well, I don't have a field. I don't have a harvest. I came from Moab. I came from Moab there, and I'm trying to provide for my mother-in-law, Naomi. Maybe she called her mother, Naomi. That would be I imagine that would feel pretty embarrassing. I imagine it feel embarrassing as she's looking at others who may be doing this for a living or working some extra money. She's doing it just to survive, and she's looking at the other handmaidens there as they're maybe talking and whispering about, who's that woman there? She didn't have very nice clothes. What's she wearing there? And she wouldn't have, by the way. And she's reaping in this field. It's a humbling thing for her to do this, but God is going to provide for her. God's grace is going to be evident in her life because of her trust in providing and in using the means that God had provided. And again, when it says in verse 3, look at verse 3, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. It means she just happened to. It wasn't on purpose. But if you know God, if you look at him in the Bible, if you see how God works, not like you understand him, but you understand that God is in control, that God's providence reigns supreme. It doesn't mean that God goes against our will, but God is always working, that nothing happens by accident. It just so happened in Ruth's part that she came to the field that was belonging to Boaz. But God is orchestrating this. God is working something out. As I think about how God uses all these different people to make the hymns that we sing. Uses somebody maybe that has a testimony that inspires a writer who gets together with a musician, puts this all together. Yes, God uses people, but he orchestrates it all together. God is going to orchestrate this together. He uses Naomi to her faith, which, as weak as it was a cause for Ruth coming to know the Lord. He's going to use Ruth coming to this field, providing for Naomi. He's going to use Boaz, who apparently here stayed during the time of famine to work his field and having a field available there, who right now was a mighty man of wealth. Each of these people, God is orchestrating these circumstances, but even though we have God's grace, we also have Ruth working. Because she's trusting in God. By trusting in God's means of provision, she's going out and working, and I'd say working hard in that field. I don't know about you, but I don't think any one of us are, I think a lot of us, I think most of us in this church, probably everybody in this room, we like to a degree, maybe working with our hands. We like doing work, but I don't know how many of us really like working hard, working past what we want to work. Ruth would have had to work hard. She's not only providing for herself, she's providing for her mother-in-law. It's hard enough for a poor person to earn enough food for themselves, but also for a family there? Boy, it would be tough for Ruth. But she trusted in God's means provision. I want you to know that, at least in my opinion, I don't think that Ruth was over the loss of her husband. I don't know how many years it had been. I don't know how many months or weeks it had been since Ruth's husband passed away. But I believe she'd still be thinking about him. But she went forward. It doesn't mean that she wasn't still grieving. It does not mean that Ruth was untouched by her husband's death. It doesn't mean she was untouched by her own mother-in-law's grief and what she had to go through. I believe even more than that, Ruth, as she was going in the field there, and she'd maybe see some family members talking to each other. She'd maybe see some kids with each other and thinking, and maybe she'd start thinking about her family again back in Moab. But she doesn't have the family anymore. They're back in Moab, and now she's taking care of Naomi. I don't believe she just snapped out of it and somehow got over that grief. I think she was still grieving. But grieving does not mean that we don't go forward according to God's word, the best I can tell. God still has a plan for us, and she's going to continue working. As she works, she's going to work for her living from morning till evening throughout barley and wheat harvest. But Ruth reaching out to God still involved hard work. I don't think it's separately. If you look at what the disciples did, say, was it the disciples, when they followed Christ, was it because of themselves that they were so spiritual? No. All they were doing, Jesus' disciples, when Christ would go somewhere, they would follow. When Christ would go here, they'd go there. When Christ would command them to do something, that's what they would do. So it was not themselves that was producing any fruit in their lives. The bottom line is, it was just because they were following Christ. Yet, in following Christ, it took hard work. They traveled, the disciples, they'd journey from place to place. They'd endure persecution in different places they'd go to. After Christ rose again and went to heaven on the right hand of God the Father, they certainly endured lots of persecution after that. But it was all in obedience and following God. Obedience and trusting God does not mean that there's not hard work involved, but it's where the work is coming from. It's not pulling up our bootstraps, and it's not saying, I'm going to take care of this, I'm going to get myself out of this mess. It's trusting in God's provision, which does involve work, but it's trusting in God's provision. I don't think everybody has the same amount of physical energy. I don't think everybody has the same amount of talents. I don't think we all have the same abilities. But I think God calls us to go forward the best we can. Remember in the New Testament, the parable of the talents, they were all given different amount of talents, 1 5, 1 2, 1 1. It's not about, the person who had the 2 talents, the person who had the 5 talents, the master was equally pleased with both of them. It wasn't that the person with 5 talents automatically got more. It's just that he used what was given to him. The person with 2 talents used what was given to them. The person with the 1 talent didn't do anything with it. Maybe because he thought it's only 1 talent. But the master was angry with him because he didn't use that 1 talent. We're to do whatever God has given us the ability to do. And honestly, the less we have, maybe we think the less we can do. Maybe we're less encouraged to do something. But that's not what God has. Ruth used what abilities she had, and it's disobedience or disbelief to do nothing with what God has given us. Look, if you would, at verse 7. We'll skip down to there. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. I don't know, by the way, that Ruth was legally required to ask. She was a proselyte. She was doing this for Naomi. So I don't know that she was legally required to ask and say, may I glean of your field? I think there was wisdom involved in doing that. Because again, if you're wondering, who's out there in my field and what are they doing? But she asked, I'm guessing here, but maybe she wanted to know, where is God going to be gracious to me at? Is it going to be in this field? Let me ask and see what happens here. She asked, and by the way, I don't see anywhere in this story. In fact, look if you would at chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. I don't know this, but I'm not thinking she maybe started in that field that was Boaz. I think she kind of wandered over into his field. Maybe she started out in one field and it didn't seem like those reapers were being too nice to her. Maybe she just kind of came over to Boaz's field and asked the head person there, would it be all right if I did this? I'm just saying that because I don't know how often in life we start something and immediately it's a success. I think most things in life are not that way. I think anything worthwhile usually takes time. And I don't know how many people she asked, but all I know is she asked and she worked. And then verse 7 says again, and she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued, even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. This part convicts me, because I know what it's like to start something, but not want to continue it. So do you, I think. Ruth not only got out in that field and maybe with some youthful fervor, got out in that field and said, I'm going to do this. In the morning, maybe that's easy. But now that she goes to the hot part of the day, the Bible says she's still continuing out there in that field. God's grace is going to be evident in her life in a moment, but she continued on. Really, all I basically have to say about this passage this evening, that's as far as I plan to go, is that I see that this story of redemption is continuing. It's not that Ruth is somehow, first she trusts in God, and now she's not going to trust God. She's going to do things on her own. It's because of her trust in God that she's going to take advantage of what God has provided. It's going to involve work. It's not pulling up her bootstraps and about herself. It's just taking advantage of the plan that God had given her out of obedience to God. And really, it's new to her. I bet just a year before this, she knew nothing about this gleaning thing. She had maybe heard from Naomi on the way to Israel. Might have been the first time she heard about this. Asking Naomi, now, what are we going to do for food when we get there? And Naomi may have told her, well, there's a law in Israel that we can glean. Now, what's gleaning about? What do you mean we glean? And don't people reap all the harvest of their field? And so maybe she's learning all about this. And you know what? The Christian life, I think, is that way. Maybe there's principles in the Bible we've known about all along, but we're now just start to apply, or apply in a new way. I think the Christian life should be like that. We're continuing forward, learning about God, continuing to trust Him. And boy, God is going to show His grace and is showing His grace to Ruth, not only Naomi, because they're responding to Him.